welcome to episode 71 of the Breaking Bio podcast. I'm Morgan Jackson, and this week we're joined by 4 graduate students from Columbia University in New York who are all here talking about their work on mammal conservation.
My name is Kat Yorick. I am at Columbia University. I'm a first-year master's student at E3B, which is Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology for conservation biology. And what I'm going to be looking at is the impact of noise pollution on large carnivores and herbivores in South African protected areas, specifically one reserve near Kruger National Park.
So that's really interesting. So are you looking at pretty much the ecotourism, so all of the cars carrying people that have gone from long distances to drive into these parks and get a look at these animals, or is this going to be more like regular day-to-day traffic? Are these roads used by regular commuters and transport?
So yeah, I'm looking at the regular commuters and transport. As South Africa becomes more and more developed, there's going to be more money that's going into the actual public roads. I believe in the next 3 years there's going to be approximately 140 million US dollars that are going into, or equivalent of US dollars going into road infrastructure. And that's not specifically in these private reserves or in these protected areas, but actually bordering them. And they're getting closer and closer to the reserves, almost to the actual perimeter. So I'm going to be looking at the impact of these public roads and how they affect the animals inside the reserve.
So what's the potential impact of actual noise rather than just the roads themselves on these animals?
So noise pollution has actually been seen to cause negative effects on a lot of marine animals, on small mammals, communication for birds, and a lot of North American large mammals, but no one's really looked at terrestrial mammals outside of North America. So that's why I'm going to be looking at the actual effects, and that kind of goes into stress, it goes into avoidance of specific habitats that they might actually be interested in, and so it kind of closes the habitat utilization areas that they can, that these animals can use, and this is especially a problem for small protected areas when there's not that much room where these elephants, these rhinos, these cheetahs, and these lions can actually move towards.
So are you going to be able to go over to South Africa during the course of your work? And if so, are you recording both the sound, and how are you going to be telling how it's affecting these large animals?
So actually, for the last 3 years before I came to Columbia, I was working on a small private game reserve doing large carnivore research. So I'm going to be going out to South Africa this summer, and we've had a large carnivore group, conservation group, research group out there for a very long time. So I'm actually going to be looking at the data from 2006 to 2013 and using GIS, using mapping to determine if these animals are avoiding the roads. But then I'll also be, when I'm out there in the field, I'm going to be measuring the noise coming from these paved roads, these bordering dirt roads, and see how far they're going into the bush and how it's affecting them.
I guess one thing that I read your brief abstract, and so my research area is sexual selection, and I have read all these papers where it's kind of birds and insects and things where they've maybe gone onto a different evolutionary pathway because of anthropogenic noise, or they have to invest more energy in communication to make their signal, to increase the intensity of signaling. So if you have something like elephants where maybe they're social animals that use calls to communicate with each other, do you think that's going to be affected greatly by vehicle noise, or is this not really something you're going to be looking at?
It's a very interesting idea, and I like the idea of it. I'm not going to be specifically looking at it, but it would be something great for future research and see if that's really impacting elephants. I don't know if natural selection is going to lead that towards elephants, and I guess it's also dependent. These populations in South Africa are usually in small protected areas, so it might impact South African elephants, but if you're looking at Kenya or Tanzania, they're much more widespread. There's much more open areas, and same with different parts in South Africa as well. So I think that would really be dependent. So I don't think that there's only small populations within these small protected areas that are really going to be impacted, and the rest maybe not so much. I think what will be most interesting to look at is I think that the large herbivores, so I'm looking at African elephants, white rhinos, cheetahs, and lions specifically. And I think these large herbivores are going to be avoiding the roads a lot more than the carnivores. Some of these carnivores, lions and cheetahs, they actually like to use the bordering roads along closer to the fence line to move from one place to the other. So it'll be very interesting to see if they actually are having an impact from these roads, or if maybe they're using them to their advantage and making it a little bit easier for them to get from point A to point B. But I think that the elephants and the rhinos, which utilize their hearing a little bit more and are in much more danger in terms of predators, that they're going to be the ones that are actually avoiding the areas that have the paved road near them.
Sweet, that's a pretty good hypothesis. What? How many roads are generally going through these? So how much of a threat is this anthropogenic noise?
So it's very dependent on what reserve you're looking at. So the reserve that I am looking at, it's basically a triangle, and the hypotenuse is a paved road, and then the rest is bordering by dirt roads, and they are literally right next to the fence line. So there's many times where lots of cars will actually stop along the way because they're seeing a lion walk by or the elephants feeding or whatnot. So it's very, very close, and that is the case for a lot of the reserves that are around the area. I can't speak for the entirety of South Africa, but in the specific area that I'm going to be looking at, it's basically right on top of each other.
Huh. And final question before we let you go off the hook here. Is this a concern for those that are considering going on safari? So are there cars that you take into safari, are these of concern, or do you think this is such a minimal impact that it's probably not as big a concern as people poking them?
It's a concern to some reserves. The private game reserve that I'm working on, they have many different rules that are very specific to protect these animals and make sure that it's okay. So it really depends on which reserve, which tourism industry you're following and you're going on. But for the most part, if they're smart about it, they've already limited the speed that you can go, how many vehicles can approach the animals at a time. So you just have to be smart about which lodge you're going to. But for the most part, these managers, these reserve managers, know what they're doing. So it's more of the roads from the outside as opposed to the ones on the inside.
Awesome. So where can people follow along with your crazy safari that you'll be going on this summer? Are they anywhere that you blog or post? I
do blog. It is K.O. and her charismatic megafauna at WordPress. So you can follow me there, and I also have a Twitter account, which is Kaggle Rock, K-A-G-G-L-E-R-O-C-K. So anyone is more than welcome to follow me on either one of those.
Awesome. I hope many of our visitors do, because it sounds like you got a lot of fun coming up this summer.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So hi, my name is Erin Demech. I'm a first-year master's student in Columbia's E3B department in the Conservation Biology program. I work with groups of gut microbes in mice that are very important for immune system functioning. Specifically for my research, what we'll be doing this summer is working at the Bronx Zoo. We're transitioning wild house mice into captivity over multiple generations, and we're going to be investigating how their gut microbes change with the introduction of a captive diet. A second part to the project will also be sampling wild deer mice along an urbanization gradient. So we'll be collecting mice from urban, suburban, and rural populations and seeing how their groups of gut microbes compare to one another.
Awesome. So, I mean, that's something you don't really think about generally when you're thinking about conservation biology is the stuff within. So what kind of gut microbes are we talking about with these mice?
So the group that I'm focusing on specifically are called segmented filamentous bacteria, or SFB for short. They have been shown to have a really tight relationship with the immune system and are very important, especially in mice, and as well as other species. We're in the study of it and looking at some other species as well. So in the world of gut microbes, there's 3 major groups. So you have Bacteroidetes, Firmicutes, and Proteobacteria. So we're also going to be seeing how the ratios of those 3 groups change.
Are these kind of bacteria, when you said species, do you mean other mouse species or other larger species? Is this something that you think is going to be applicable to other mammals in captive populations?
So we're only working with mice this summer. We're working with 2 species of mice, house mice, which have been extensively studied in the lab. So that's why we picked that species, because there's a good baseline to compare to in the captive studies. And then we're also going to be looking at wild white-footed deer mice, because they're close relatives of house mice. So we assume that they'll have SFB in their system. As far as being applicable to other species, there are other species that have SFB, so humans have them, fish, chickens, but it's a kind of a new field, so there's not much work that's been done yet, but I presume that in the future this will be more applicable to other species.
I think it's, I mean, like I said, it's something that a lot of people, you hear these conservation programs where they're going to, zoo raise something, get the populations up, and then put them back out. I personally would never have thought of making sure that they have, their native gut fauna as well as all the other microbes going along. So I think that's a really interesting avenue. Do you think that this is something that zoos and conservation programs are going to have to start thinking about more the more we learn about the importance of gut microbes?
I think in every field, this is something that people are going to start thinking about more. In the past few years, the gut microbiota has really been, it's become evident. It's been called the forgotten organ. So I think in every field, because it's such a base level of health in humans and animals, this is going to become increasingly important.
So this might be outside the kind of realm of your project, but I was just wondering if the captive ones have fewer of these bacteria, then are there knock-on effects from this? So if it's affecting their immune function, do they have to, allocate more energy or something to trying to boost their immune function? Does this change their behavior or other life history traits or anything like that?
So I probably should have mentioned in my introduction, we're kind of zoning in on how a captive diet affects these mice. So we're feeding one group a standard captive diet, and we're feeding another group a wild type diet that varies by season, so something much more similar to what mice would find in the wild. So the results from this study will basically inform captive managers if a varied diet will increase SFBs and improve immune function in these mice. So that's really the only thing we'll probably get out of this.
Sorry, so you were going to be comparing them to the wild type, the dormice, and so when you say the house mouse, are these the little white ones that everybody uses for genetic studies?
So house mice they're brown, so they're not white. They're kind of like light brownish. I'm not sure what species the white ones are, but in the lab that I work in, they use captive house mice, which are the little brown ones. So.
Literally the ones everybody sees in their house generally in the spring and the fall that are causing troubles.
Right.
So when we're talking about their captive diet, are we talking about what they're professionally feeding them, or because if they live in our houses, is their wild diet just kind of like our food?
Yeah, so that is going to be a limitation of the study. So we're capturing wild mice from the grounds of the Bronx Zoo. We try to do it in more forested areas to be away from people food and other captive animal food. But it is very possible that these mice are eating something that wouldn't be 100% typical in a completely wild environment. But I think the major point is that it's much more varied than what they're getting in the zoos.
If you had to guess, do you think that your work is going to really change how zoos feed their organisms in the future?
I'm not sure if it will completely change, but I think it's a really good starting point, and I think it's also good just to start captive managers thinking about this kind of stuff. Often captive managers do obviously care about the health of their animals, but I don't think they investigate these changes at such a deep level. So I think it's really important at least to get the ball rolling on these kind of things.
Awesome. So where can people follow along as you research the gut microbes of little mice?
So I do have a Twitter. It's just at Erin, Erin Demech, Dimech.
Awesome. I'm sure that people will be very interested to hear how this goes, and especially those that are working in the conservation and the zoo fields, because I think it's going to be a little eye-opening for everybody. Thanks a lot for talking to us.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Jessica Stitt. I'm a first-year master's student at Columbia University in the conservation biology program, and I study trophic, a community of in the Amazon rainforest, looking at fruiting trees, fruit-eating mammals, and dung beetles, to kind of see how they interact and ask questions about how the biodiversity in the system is structured, and how it changes over time.
So we're talking about poop here is essentially what we're talking about.
Yes, fruit and poop, and how they're linked. Yeah. Poop is one of my favorite things. So I worked in a lab previously where I looked at DNA and hormone analysis, and you can get a lot of information about species and their stress and their phylogenetic relatedness. And now looking at how dung beetles use it and how they can potentially act as indicator species for the health of a forest and which particular mammals are living in the forest adds an extra dimension to how cool poop is. But yeah, so there's some species of dung beetles that are more specialized, and so some of the mammals in this forest include primates like spider monkeys and capuchin monkeys, tapirs, agoutis, a bunch of different rodents and squirrels, a lot of things that eat fruit, and some of the dung beetles are specialized with the primates only, and so if you find those, if you're trying to do a survey of a system to see kind of how healthy the ecosystem is, and you find those certain species, you might be able to assume, okay, well, we have primates here that might be harder to spot just through doing surveys. They might be a lot harder to see and a lot more time intensive to find them.
So essentially, it's a lot easier to find the turds than it is to find these arboreal species. And so, well, I tried to work low-hanging fruit in there, but it didn't quite work. But but that actually kind of makes sense, that it would be a lot easier to find the dung beetles. And stop me if I haven't interpreted this correctly, but essentially letting the dung beetles indicate when some of these species that are much harder to spot are around.
Yes. Yes, so it's actually pretty hard to find the dung in the forest, just because in the tropics everything disappears really quickly. It's either degrades or gets washed away by rain, or is eaten by dung beetles and stuff. So what we do is set pitfall traps for the beetles, and then collect those, and then we can look at those and figure out the species, and also kind of do that more systematically, where we don't have to do surveys, but we can set up a transect system and place the traps and kind of see what the community is like. And the other aspect to my research project is looking at fruiting pulses. And so in the tropics, there's sometimes, usually right after a wet season, a bunch of fruit at the same time, and that shifts over the course of the year. And in that fruiting season, you might have kind of the community change, and so my research is looking at, do the populations of mammals and then the populations of dung beetles kind of follow where the fruit is each month, and kind of how that changes kind of the nutrient deposits in a system, and where you can find a lot of species and where you can kind of get a better sense of how a community changes and shifts over the course of a year.
So this is kind of tangential and possibly a stupid question, but you have these mammals that eat the fruit and then they poo, and then the beetles eat the poo. Do you have any mammals that eat the beetles?
There's some evidence, potentially agoutis eat them. As far as I know, there's not all that much evidence yet on mammals that prey specifically on the dung beetles. But yeah, so that's another aspect that I'm looking into, of what extent is it almost dangerous for them to be around these high density mammal situations, if they're more likely to get preyed upon, or if it's not really a big factor for them. And they range in size. Some are really small and some are a bit bigger, and so that would affect they're kind of a very diverse community within themselves. They have a whole range of factors affecting them.
I think it's really cool, and it sounds like a really ambitious project. Not only trying to figure out, one project, you're talking about two, and then you're adding the third being the tritrophic levels. How are you? I'm just curious. How are you handling that much data? Because I'm sure there's a lot of it.
Yeah. So for the initial stage of what I'm doing this summer is mostly focusing on the data and looking at kind of just presence-absence data. So we have two plots that are grids, and they've been walked as transects, and people, if they saw fruiting trees or they saw the mammals, they wrote it down and recorded where. And so we have the GPS locations, and for the dung beetles we have the traps. And so what I'm looking at is kind of, I almost think of it as like 3 pieces of transparency paper, and you have the fruiting trees down, and you can say, here are the fruiting trees, and then you put the mammal data on top of that for the same time period and say, this is where the mammals are, and then you have the dung beetles on top of that and say, this is where the dung beetles are. And so my main focus is going to be looking at the co-occurrence patterns and see, is the diversity of beetles greater where there's more mammals? Is the diversity of mammals greater where there's more trees fruiting? And that's my going hypothesis, is that they're going to be linked much more that way. But then beyond that, also looking at the structure of that diversity. Is it a lot of generalist species? Are there a lot of specialist species? And that's all going to be dependent on which trees, too. Some trees, like figs, attract a lot more different types of species. Other ones might be much more specialized to only primates or potentially only rodents. So it's definitely a lot of data analysis. It's a fun thing to get into.
Do they co-occur at the same time, or do you need to look at time lags between, the mammals arriving and then the beetles arriving after that, and kind of following on from each other?
Yeah, the data is collected at the same time, and the dung beetles is a little bit of a lag, just in terms of the collecting schedule. And so we have it once or twice per month for several sequential months, and so kind of be looking more at the monthly scale of seeing if they're linked that way. But yeah, it is really hard to get them all paired at the exact same time, just in terms of the collecting. Some of these forests flood, and so this is in kind of within the western Amazon basin, kind of in the heart of Brazil, right near the edge with Peru. And so getting access into those areas, and they're reserved areas, accessing those areas and sampling them. I didn't get to do it, but potentially in the future, I would like to join in on the project because, yeah, you'd have to really plan out your days, and also it's affected by if it's raining or not, because that would change the behavior of the animals.
And also, it would be nice to go to Brazil.
That would be nice.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like a lot of work. So is there any way people can keep up with your poo tracking and various things around it?
Sure, yeah. So I have a Twitter right now, @JessMStitt. Stitt is S-T-I-T-T. And I have, at the moment, it's an inactive blog, but it will become more active this summer, and it tracks my previous work. Before coming to the master's program, I worked in Indonesia, and before that, studied abroad in Costa Rica. And that's jessmstitt.blogspot.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Thank you, guys.
Hi, my name is Allison Roth. I'm a first-year grad student at Columbia University in Marine Accords Lab, and currently I am studying the territorial system of blue monkeys in Kakamega Forest in Kenya, Africa. So more specifically, I'm looking to see what factors might influence the outcome of intergroup encounters in these monkeys. So an intergroup encounter happens when two groups of monkeys can see or hear one another, and at least one of these groups responds to the presence of the other group. Now, neighbors at Kakamega really do not like each other in terms of neighbor monkeys, so a lot of our intergroup interactions are pretty aggressive. So we think that one of 3 things could be happening to determine the outcome of these aggressive intergroup encounters. One, which is the simplest explanation, could be something that we call site-independent dominance. And basically, it just means that when two groups meet, the larger group is always going to win simply because it has a numerical advantage. Now, the second option is that something called site-dependent dominance could be going on. where the group that uses the area the intergroup encounter occurs more frequently actually will beat the group that uses this area less frequently. Now, the thinking behind this is that the more frequently a group uses an area, the more it's going to value that area. And this happens because knowledge is really power. So the more an animal uses an area, the more it's going to know where are good spots to hide from predators, where are particularly yummy fruit trees. So it's going to be more willing to take more risks when fighting over this area, and this willingness to take increased risks will confer an advantage to this group. So to bring this a little bit closer to home, think about two kids that are fighting over a toy. Now, one kid just really, really loves this toy. It's his favorite toy in the whole wide world. And the other kid's kind of like, well, that's kind of cool. I think I'd like to give it a spin for 5 minutes. Well, the kid that really loves the toy is probably going to kick the other kid's butt because, well, it really loves that toy. The other kid's probably going to be like, after a few minutes of the fight, it's going to be like, this is just way, way too much effort. You just have that toy. I'm done with it already. So same thing kind of happens with animals. Now, the third possible thing that could happen would be that it would be a combination of these two factors. So numerical advantage could weigh heavily into the situation. However, some groups may use specific areas, just really tiny areas, very, very heavily, maybe because it's a really good sleeping spot and it's really safe from predators, or because there's a really yummy, just really juicy fruit tree that's there, and it'll fight really heavily for that area, so a smaller group may defeat a larger group in these areas. So that's what my current research is focused on. Are there any questions that I can answer?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it sounds like there's a lot going on. So
Definitely.
you said that these encounters are often violent, and I can imagine so if they're over massive resources. So are we talking like full-out war between? Because we've all seen the nature videos of chimpanzees going one-on-one each other.
Fortunately, it's not that aggressive. So as you probably know, chimpanzees, the second they get the chance to kill a member of an opposing group, they're at it. They'll even cannibalize the young of the other group, which is terrifying to me. Unfortunately, our monkeys don't get quite that aggressive. Quite often we'll see aggressive vocalizations, we'll often see lunges and chases, and occasionally we will see violent physical contact. For example, I was watching a video the other day where 7 monkeys were piled on top of one poor little female just fighting the crap out of her. But as far as I know, we have not witnessed any deaths occurring during these intergroup encounters, which is good for me because I'm an animal lover and I really don't want to watch monkeys killing each other.
Yeah, that would be tough in the field. So this is more displaying of power, and
Exactly.
we could kill you if we really wanted to, but it's a lot of bluff.
Exactly, and they're just very concerned with defending their resources, as they rightly should be, because their resources are very essential to survival and reproduction in this species, as well as any other species for that matter.
Yeah, for sure. So I got to imagine that doing sort of this field work has got to be pretty challenging if you've got to be following along multiple troops of these monkeys, and I assume they're arboreal, so you'll be looking up all the time. So is this what's some of the challenges of carrying on this research out in the wild?
So one of the challenges is that it's extremely hard, especially when they are up in the trees, to count the number of monkeys that are actually participating in these intergroup encounters. Occasionally the intergroup encounters do occur in the ground, but often, like you said, they occur very, very far up in the tree. So instead of looking at the number participating in the intergroup encounters to determine relative group size between each group, we're going to be taking the entire group size as opposed to the group that's participating in the intergroup encounter, although there is probably some difference in the two, but it's just too hard. Things are way, way, way too crazy to count the individual monkeys when these things are going on.
Yeah, I can only imagine. So the other thing was, when these things are going crazy, like, are you guys identifying individuals, or how can you tell who's on which, the defending or the aggressive side?
That's a great question. So it actually takes a lot of time to learn these individuals because we don't tag them like some researchers do tag their monkeys with color tags and whatnot, but we do it all by facial ID. So fortunately, we usually have multiple observers watching these intergroup encounters, which makes it a lot easier as opposed to one person trying to do this whole thing by themselves.
I could totally imagine that. And so, when these aggressive encounters happen, how much of a swing in in territory sizes are we talking? Is it like a single tree? They have one of these battles over a single fruit tree, or is it kind of like we'll have this battle over a couple of 100 square meters or something?
Right, good question. Usually it's over a particularly fruitful tree that both groups just really, really want. So I'm also going to look to see how the intensity and duration might fluctuate depending on spatial use and group size.
That's a lot of effort to get one tree, but I guess there's a lot of resources to do that.
Definitely.
Okay, well, I guess we're pretty much out of time for this episode. Where can people follow along for the rest of your research as you go and explore more monkey conflicts?
Well, you can partially follow my work on the Quartz Lab site here at Columbia. Unfortunately, I do not blog or do Twitter, but I would also be expecting to see a couple publications coming out in the next year or so, so keep an eye open for those.
Awesome. I'm sure everybody at home will be quite excited to see it. Thanks a lot for talking to us today.
Thank you so much, Morgan. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for this episode, but you can find more information about our guest today, as well as all of our past episodes at our website at breakingbio.com. You can also find us on Twitter at breakingbio, where we've put together a comprehensive Twitter list that allows you to stay up to date with what our guests have been doing. You can also find us on Facebook by searching for the Breaking Bio podcast. Thanks for listening, and we hope to see you next week.